I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. The idea was to challenge myself. Just me, my pack, and miles of untouched wilderness. The trail was deep in the backcountry, far from cell service, far from roads, and far from people. That was the appeal. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel more alive. I checked my gear one last time: map, compass, water, food, extra clothes, knife, first aid kit. Everything was there. I locked my car and took my first steps onto the dirt path, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots. The first few miles were peaceful. The only sounds were birds calling to each other and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. My pack was heavy, but I had trained for this. Every step felt good. After about 6 miles, the trail started to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches blocking out more of the sky. The path narrowed, barely wide enough for me to walk without brushing against thick bushes on either side. The ground became uneven, roots snaking across the dirt like veins. I stumbled a few times but caught myself before I fell. I was supposed to reach a small clearing by midday, where I planned to rest and eat. But the trail felt longer than expected. When I finally checked my map, I realized I had veered slightly off course. Not by much, but enough to make me uneasy. I adjusted my direction and pushed on, but something felt different now. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The rustling had stopped. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, like the trees were swallowing the sound. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, deep in the soft earth. Someone else had been here, but that didn't make sense. This was a remote trail and I hadn't passed anyone. I crouched down to get a better look. The prints were strange. Not boots, not sneakers. They were bare feet, human but wide, with toes that seemed too long. My stomach twisted. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the stillness. I walked faster, my heart pounding. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe someone had hiked barefoot. Maybe it was old, and the rain had just made it look fresh. Then I found the second set of prints. These weren't walking, they were running, and they were next to mine. I stopped breathing for a moment. The tracks had appeared beside my own, like someone had been following me, just a few steps away. But I had heard nothing, seen nothing. A wave of fear washed over me, deep and primal. I turned, ready to go back the way I came, but the trail looked different. Had it always been this twisted? The trees loomed closer, their bark dark and wet like they were breathing. I forced myself to move. I needed to keep walking to find my way back. I couldn't let panic take over. I followed my footprints, heart hammering, eyes scanning every shadow. Then I heard it, a sound I will never forget. Breathing. It was soft, controlled, just behind me. Not an animal, not wind, person. I spun around, my knife already in my hand. Nothing, but the footprints were closer now. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, my pack slamming against my back. Branches tore at my arms, my legs, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to move. The trail twisted, disoriented me, but I didn't stop. I reached a stream, my boots sinking into the mud. I turned, gasping for breath. No one was there. No footprints. Just the rush of water and the wind picking up again. I forced myself to think. If I followed the stream, I would eventually hit the main trail. I moved fast, not stopping, not daring to look back. The forest felt alive around me, but I didn't listen. I just ran. When I finally saw my car in the distance, My legs nearly gave out. I stumbled, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the trail one last time. The trees stood still, the path empty. But just before I turned the key, I saw it. At the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows, something was watching me. I didn't stay to find out what. I haven't been back since. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before sunrise. The gravel lot was empty except for a rusted sedan near the entrance, probably abandoned. The air was crisp, carrying the damp scent of morning dew and rotting leaves. My pack was heavy on my shoulders, stuffed with food, water, a small tent, and a first aid kit. This was supposed to be a solo overnight hike. Just me, the trail, and the silence of the forest. I had studied the route for weeks. It was a 20-mile loop through dense woodland, with a river crossing about halfway in. The Park Service website warned about poor cell service and unpredictable weather, but I liked the challenge. I wanted isolation, a break from the noise of work, traffic, and everyday life. The first few miles were easy. The dirt trail was well worn, lined with towering pines that blocked most of the morning sun. Birds chirped somewhere above me, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. I kept a steady pace, stopping only for water or to check my map. Around mile 6, the terrain changed. The ground sloped upward, rocks jutting out like broken teeth. My boots crunched over dry leaves and twigs as I pushed forward. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No more birds, no rustling from small animals, just my own footsteps and breathing. By noon, I reached the river crossing. The water was faster than I expected, swollen from recent rains. I found a fallen tree spanning the width and carefully walked across, arms out for balance. The log was slick, but I made it over without slipping. On the other side, the forest thickened. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled roots twisting over the path. I noticed something odd: no trail markers. The entire hike, I'd seen wooden posts with bright orange blazes nailed to them, but here nothing, just endless trees stretching in every direction. I pulled out my map. According to it, I was on the right path, but something felt off. The air was heavier, the light dimmer. The sun should have been high overhead, but the canopy was so thick, only faint beams made it through. I shook it off and pressed on. A few hours later, I came across an old campsite. A rusted fire ring sat in the center, half buried under pine needles. A few feet away, a collapsed tent sagged into the earth, its fabric shredded. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Inside the tent was a tattered sleeping bag, partially unzipped, covered in dirt and leaves.
No gear, no backpack.
No sign of anyone. I crouched down and nudged the sleeping bag with my boot. It was empty, just an abandoned camp, left to decay. Still, something about it felt wrong. The forest was silent, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I stood up, suddenly aware of how alone I was. I moved faster after that, checking my map every few minutes. But the trail was gone. I should have been heading west, but the sun, now low in the sky, told me I was off course. My gut clenched. I turned back the way I came, walking quickly. After an hour, I should have reached the river. I didn't. I kept walking. Another hour passed. Still nothing. I was lost. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had food, water, a tent. I could stay the night and find my way back in the morning. I found a small clearing and set up my tent as the last light faded. The moment I sat down, exhaustion hit me like a truck. I didn't sleep well. The forest was too quiet. No wind, no night insects, just silence. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy moving through the brush. I held my breath. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. The sound moved closer, slow and steady. Then it stopped, right outside my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then a soft crunch, footsteps. 2, maybe 3. My mouth went dry. I stayed still, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the sounds faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I packed up and started walking. My only goal was to find the river and retrace my steps. I walked for hours, legs aching, throat dry, but the forest was different.
No landmarks. No familiar turns.
Just trees. My compass spun uselessly, as if the very air was twisting my sense of direction. Then I saw it, a shape through the trees. Relief flooded me. Another campsite. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the same campsite, the same fire ring, the same collapsed tent, the same shredded sleeping bag. I had been walking in circles. My vision blurred. My knees felt weak. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I took out my map, my hands shaking. I marked my location and took a new direction. I walked for what felt like hours, my feet raw with blisters. The trees never changed. The light never shifted. I checked my map again. Somehow, I had made it back to the same campsite. I dropped to my knees. My body was too exhausted to process fear. I wasn't just lost. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. I forced myself up and started walking again. I don't know how long I moved, maybe hours, maybe days. My food ran out. My water was gone. My legs burned with every step. Then suddenly the trees thinned. The sky opened up. I stumbled forward and found myself back at the river. My knees buckled, and I let out a choked sob. The log I had crossed before was still there. I scrambled over it, barely able to hold myself up. Once on the other side, the world felt different. Lighter, clearer. I kept moving, not stopping, not looking back. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was setting. My truck was still there. I climbed inside, hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back at the trees. I didn't try to understand what happened. I just drove. I won't go back. I don't know what was out there, or if it was just my own mind breaking under exhaustion and fear. But some part of me knows whatever it was real. I had been hiking for years, always preferring to go alone. There was something about the solitude, the rhythm of my own footsteps on dirt, and the quiet rustling of the trees that made me feel at ease. I had taken on longer and more challenging trails over the years, but this one was different. The plan was simple: a 3-day solo trek through a remote section of national forest deep in the mountains. The trail wasn't well known, but I had researched it thoroughly. It was rarely trafficked, and from what I had read, it could be a bit rough in parts, but nothing beyond my experience. I packed accordingly, bringing extra supplies, a GPS, a compass, a good knife, and my usual emergency kit. Day 1 started off normal. I parked my car at the small gravel lot where the trailhead was barely marked. The first few miles were steady, a mix of gentle inclines and thick woods. The air was crisp, and I could hear the occasional bird chirping or a squirrel rustling in the undergrowth. It was peaceful. By mid-afternoon, I had made good progress. The sun was still high, so I took a short break, eating a granola bar and drinking some water before continuing. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no sounds.
No birds. No rustling.
Just silence. It was subtle at first, but then it became unnerving. Normally, even in the most isolated parts of a forest, you'd hear something wind through the trees, an insect buzzing, something. But here there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the faint crunch of my boots on the ground. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. Maybe it was just one of those moments when everything seemed to pause, but it lasted. As the sun started to lower, I found a clearing by a small stream and set up camp. It was a perfect spot, flat ground, water nearby, plenty of space. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. As I sat there eating my dinner, the silence was still there. No wind,
No insects.
just the occasional crackling of the fire. I told myself it was fine. I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, a single snap of a twig. It was close, too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I listened, waiting for more movement, but there was nothing. It wasn't an animal sound. I knew that much. An animal would have kept moving, rustling the bushes, but this, just one sound, and then nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods. Nothing. I circled my campsite slowly, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to get into my tent, zipping it up tight. My knife was next to me, my headlamp within reach. I listened. Hours passed, but there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a light, restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun barely peeking through the trees. As I stepped out of my tent, something made my stomach drop. There were footprints, human footprints. They weren't mine. I had been careful about where I walked, and these were fresh. They circled my camp, stopping just a few feet from my tent. Someone had been watching me. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. I quickly packed up my gear, making sure nothing was missing. My food was untouched, my belongings right where I left them. Whoever had been here hadn't taken anything. They had just watched. I had two choices, turn back or push forward. I had come too far to turn back, and I wasn't about to let paranoia get the best of me. I checked my GPS and compass, making sure I was still on course, then started hiking. The forest felt different now. Every branch that swayed, every shadow between the trees, it all felt wrong. The silence had returned. By midday, I had covered a good distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, far back, deep in the trees, standing still. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, barely visible through the thick trees. I stared for what felt like forever, but it didn't move. I turned and walked faster. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge with a good vantage point. I took a break, eating a quick meal and checking my gear. As I looked down the trail I had just come from, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was there again, closer this time, still not moving. I didn't hesitate. I packed up and started moving as fast as I could without running. Running in the wilderness was dangerous. I knew that, but I had to keep going. I pushed hard, covering miles, my legs aching. The sun started to dip, and I knew I had to find a place to camp soon. But I couldn't, not when I knew someone was out there. I kept hiking into the night, using my headlamp to see the path. It wasn't safe, but stopping felt worse. Hours passed. My body screamed for rest, but I kept moving. Then, up ahead, I saw something. A structure. An old fire lookout tower. I had seen it on the map, but hadn't planned on using it. Now, it was my best option. I climbed up the wooden stairs, my legs shaking, and shut the door behind me, locking it. The place was abandoned, but it gave me a vantage point. I stayed awake, watching through the windows. The forest stretched out below, dark and endless. I scanned the tree line, Then I saw it, the figure, standing at the base of the tower. Looking up, I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. I couldn't do anything but wait. Hours passed. The figure never moved, just stood there, watching. As dawn broke, I finally looked again. They were gone. I waited until the sun was fully up before climbing down, my body stiff and exhausted. I didn't waste time. I moved fast, barely stopping for food or water. Every so often, I glanced behind me, but I saw nothing. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear in, locked the doors, and sped off, not looking back. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I should have turned back when I first felt it. That creeping unease, the kind that presses into your gut like a dull knife. But I didn't. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overthinking things, and I kept going. It started as a simple solo hike, something I'd done plenty of times before. I had planned to hike a section of an old trail in the mountains, a little off the beaten path, but still within the range of normal day hiker territory. It was early fall, the air cool but not cold, and the leaves had just started to turn. I had my pack, plenty of water, some food, and enough experience to feel confident. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well-worn but empty, and I was enjoying the solitude. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the sound of my boots crunching over dirt and fallen twigs. Then I noticed the first odd thing. A little ways off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees, there was a backpack, just sitting there, half hidden by the underbrush. It looked old, sun-bleached, and dirty, like it had been there for a long time. At first, I figured it must have been left behind by some careless hiker. Maybe someone had set it down and forgotten it, though that seemed unlikely. Who forgets their whole backpack? I debated going over to check it out, but something in me hesitated. There was no sign of a camp nearby, no footprints, no gear scattered around. Just the pack, sitting there like someone had placed it carefully and walked away. I left it alone. About an hour later, I reached a section of the trail that was narrower and more overgrown than I expected. I checked my map, making sure I was still on track. Everything looked right, but something felt off. The trees seemed closer together. The air felt heavier, like I had stepped into a place that didn't quite belong. Then I saw the second thing, a pair of boots sticking out from under a thick bush just off the path. I froze. My first thought was that someone had gotten hurt, maybe fallen and passed out. But the boots weren't upright, like someone had sat down and stretched out their legs. They were lying flat, toes pointing up. I took a slow step closer. My breath was coming faster now, my pulse thudding in my ears. I could only see the boots and part of the legs, old jeans, stiff and faded. No movement, no sound. I called out. No answer. I took another step. Then I saw the rest. The body was partially covered by leaves, the way debris naturally piles up over time. But it wasn't just fallen leaves that covered it. Someone had placed them there, deliberately, the way you might try to hide something. My stomach dropped. The skin that was visible was dry and gray, the hands curled inward. I didn't need to get any closer to know that the person had been dead for a long time. I backed up, heart hammering, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? My phone had no signal, not surprising this deep in the mountains. The nearest ranger station was miles away. I could either turn back now and report it when I got out, or what? Stay? The thought sent a cold spike of fear through me. I was alone. There was no sign of what had happened to this person, but I didn't need to know the details to understand one thing. Someone had put them there. I turned and started back the way I had come, walking fast, trying not to run. Running would be stupid. Running would mean panic, and panic meant mistakes. But as I walked, that feeling of wrongness grew. The forest seemed quieter now. Too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my footsteps, too loud in my own ears. Then I saw it. A fresh footprint on the trail ahead of me. Not mine. Someone else's. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around, but I saw nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. Just that print, pressed deep into the dirt, leading in the same direction I was going. I moved faster, my mind screaming at me to keep going, to get the hell out of there. Then another footprint, and another. They weren't old. Someone was ahead of me, or they had just been ahead of me. I forced myself to slow down, to listen. I strained to hear anything beyond my own breathing, my own heartbeat. A twig snapped. Close. Too close. I didn't stop to think. I stepped off the trail, moving carefully, crouching low behind a thick tree. I stayed still, forcing myself to breathe as quietly as possible. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw them. A man moving slowly down the trail, looking from side to side, searching. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his clothes were dirty, his posture tense. And he was carrying a knife, a big one. My body went ice cold. My mouth was dry. I didn't move. I barely breathed. He stopped, right where I had been standing minutes ago. He looked around, then knelt down, touching the footprints I had left. He stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, he stood up and kept walking, following my path. I stayed frozen in place, heart pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. I waited until he was out of sight, then longer, counting the seconds in my head. When I finally moved, my legs were shaking. I stayed off the trail, moving carefully, trying not to make a sound. I had no idea if he was alone, if he had a camp somewhere, if he was still looking for me. I just knew I had to get out. I moved as quickly as I dared, taking a different path, cutting through the trees, checking over my shoulder constantly. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like a threat. It took hours, but eventually, I made it back to the main trail, and I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the doors the second I got inside and tore out of there, driving faster than I ever had in my life. I went straight to the nearest ranger station, told them everything. They took me seriously. They sent people out. They found the body, but they didn't find the man. To this day, I don't know if he saw me, if he knew I was there watching him, if he's still out there somewhere. All I know is that I will never hike alone again. I should have known better than to go hiking alone. It was supposed to be an easy out-and-back trail, just a quiet day to clear my mind. The forest was thick with late summer growth, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. I started early, before the heat of the afternoon could settle in. The trailhead barely marked by an old wooden sign with half the letters worn away. I parked my truck, locked it, and double-checked my pack. Water, snacks, a knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, everything I thought I'd need. The first few miles were peaceful. Birds chirped somewhere high in the canopy, unseen but ever present. The wind rustled the leaves, shifting the light in dappled patches along the dirt path. The farther I went, the more I settled into a steady rhythm, my boots crunching over fallen twigs and dry leaves. About 4 miles in, the trail split. There was no mention of a fork on the map I had checked beforehand, and there weren't any trail markers. One path was clearly more traveled, the dirt packed down and the undergrowth trimmed back. The other was overgrown but still looked like a proper trail, maybe just an old route that had fallen out of use. I hesitated but figured the less traveled path might lead somewhere interesting. I had my GPS and a compass. I wasn't worried about getting lost. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The birds had stopped singing. The wind no longer rustled the leaves. The only sound was my own footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had become too used to the background noise. Still, something felt off. After another mile, the path narrowed further. I had to push through branches and step over thick roots that had grown unchecked. The air smelled different here, more like wet rock and decay. A faint buzzing filled the silence. I swatted at a fly that had landed on my arm, then noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A ripped piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. It was faded blue, maybe from a jacket or a backpack, and it looked like it had been there for a while. I felt a slight unease creep in, but pushed forward, telling myself people lose things on trails all the time. Then I saw the boot, just one, half buried in the dirt. It was caked in mud, the laces missing. I stopped and stared at it, my pulse quickening. It wasn't uncommon to find abandoned gear on hiking trails. People lost things, left things behind, but something about this felt wrong. The boot looked old but not ancient, like it hadn't been there long enough to be completely overtaken by nature. A logical person would have turned around. I considered it, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved ahead, slower now, more aware of my surroundings. The buzzing grew louder. A few steps later, I found the source. A deer carcass, half rotted, lay in the middle of the trail. Flies swarmed over it, thick and heavy, their hum filling my ears. The smell hit me all at once, a foul, sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. I gagged and stepped back. I've seen dead animals before, but this one was different. Something had torn into it, leaving deep gouges in the flesh. I don't know what made me examine it closer, but I did. The cuts weren't clean like a knife wound, but they also weren't ragged like an animal attack. They were deliberate, intentional. I should have turned around right then. I should have retraced my steps and gotten back to my truck. But I didn't. I told myself it was just a dead deer, that maybe a poacher had left it behind. I kept walking. The trail became harder to follow. It was barely a trail at all now, more like a faint path where the undergrowth had been trampled down long ago. The trees were thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering. Nothing, just trees, shadows shifting in the breeze. I walked faster. The unease was crawling up my spine now, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me to go back. The buzzing of the flies faded as I left the deer behind, but the silence pressed in heavier than before. Then I found the camp. It wasn't much, just a fire pit, long cold, surrounded by scattered trash. A few empty cans, a torn-up sleeping bag, a backpack missing its straps. It looked like someone had been there, but not for a long time. Something about it didn't feel right. The sleeping bag was slashed open, the foam stuffing spilling out. The backpack had been gutted, its contents strewn across the ground like someone had been searching for something in a hurry. I took a cautious step closer. Something crunched under my boot. I looked down. A phone, old, cracked, and dead. I bent down and picked it up. The screen was shattered, but I could still see the lock screen image. A picture of a smiling woman with a dog. The battery was long dead, but the phone itself hadn't been here long enough to be completely weathered. I turned it over in my hands, my stomach twisting. Then I heard it, a rustling somewhere off to my left. Slow, deliberate, not the sound of wind or an animal moving through the brush. Someone was there, watching me. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and started walking back the way I came, forcing myself not to break into a run. Running would mean panic, and panic would mean mistakes. I moved fast but steady, my ears straining for any sound behind me. There it was again. Footsteps, heavy, close. I sped up. The forest felt different now, darker, more closed in. The trail that had been hard to follow before felt impossible now. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, that wasn't possible. I had been paying attention. I had been careful. Something moved in the trees to my right. A flicker of motion. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I just kept moving. My breath was coming fast now, my pulse pounding in my ears. My truck wasn't far, maybe 2 miles. Just 2 miles. I could make it. Then the smell hit me again. That same rotting, sickly sweet stench from before. The deer. But I hadn't retraced my steps exactly. I shouldn't have been near it. I pushed forward, my mind screaming at me to move faster. A branch cracked. Closer this time. I ran. I don't remember the last mile clearly. Just running, heart pounding, lungs burning. The truck came into view like a beacon, parked exactly where I left it. I fumbled with my keys, nearly dropping them as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, spun the truck around so fast that gravel kicked up behind me. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just trees, just the empty trailhead. But I swear, just for a second, I saw something move. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sky was turning from black to deep blue. The air was cold, the kind that bit through my jacket and made my breath look like smoke. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a remote trail deep in the mountains, far from the crowded paths where weekend hikers gathered. I wanted solitude. I wanted to test myself. The drive to the trailhead had taken nearly 3 hours, mostly on winding roads that cut through dense forest. I parked my truck in a small gravel lot, checked my gear, and locked up. I had everything I needed: food, water, a map, compass, first aid kit, and my GPS. My plan was to hike up the ridge, follow the trail to a secluded valley, set up camp for the night, and hike back the next day. The first few miles were easy, a well-trodden path that wound through towering pines and patches of underbrush. Birds called out to each other, and the occasional rustling in the bushes reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, probably just squirrels or deer. I made good time, stopping only to adjust my pack or sip from my water bottle. About 5 miles in, the trail split. The main path continued along the ridge, but I took the lesser-traveled route that veered off into the valley. The trees grew thicker here, their branches stretching overhead, creating a tunnel of green and shadow. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. My boots crunched against the dirt and fallen leaves as I pressed forward. By midday, I had covered about 10 miles. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns of light on the forest floor. I found a flat clearing and decided to take a break. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out a protein bar, and checked my map. Everything was going according to plan. That was when I noticed something odd. The forest had gone silent.
No birds.
No rustling in the underbrush, just the distant whisper of wind through the trees. I held my breath, listening. It was strange, but I brushed it off. Maybe I had startled something. I packed up and continued. The trail became less defined, more overgrown. It was clear that not many people came this way. I had to step over fallen branches, push aside tangled vines. At one point, I nearly lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack to find it again. A few hours later, I reached the valley. It was beautiful, an open expanse with a small creek running through the middle, surrounded by dense forest and steep rock walls on either side. I found a good spot near the creek and set up camp. I gathered firewood, pitched my tent, and boiled some water for a dehydrated meal. As I ate, the silence settled in again. It wasn't just the normal quiet of being deep in the woods. It felt heavier, unnatural. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. I tried to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I was alone out here, miles from anyone. That was what I had wanted. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my breath clouded in the freezing air. Then I heard it, a crunch, the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. My pulse pounded in my ears. I strained to listen. Another crunch, closer this time. Not an animal. Too slow, too deliberate. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was the blood rushing through my head. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't know. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been near. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the forest shifting in the night. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. The plan was to loop around the valley and rejoin the main trail, but the path was harder to follow than I had expected. The undergrowth was thick, and fallen trees blocked my way. Then I saw it. A boot print. Fresh. Not mine. I stared at it, my stomach knotting. Someone had been out here. Someone had been walking near my camp in the night. My grip tightened on my knife as I scanned the woods. Nothing moved. The trees stood silent, watching. I forced myself to keep going, moving faster now. I wanted out of the valley. I needed to get back on the main trail. But the deeper I went, the harder it became. The forest was closing in, the trail almost non-existent. Then I smelled it. Foul, rotting stench. It hit me like a wave, thick and putrid. I gagged, covering my nose. Something was dead nearby. I hesitated, then stepped forward, pushing through a tangle of branches. And there it was, a deer, or what was left of one. Its body had been torn open, ribs jutting from its side. The flesh was fresh, red and wet. No sign of scavengers, no sign of a struggle, just torn apart. Something wasn't right. My brain screamed at me to move, to get out. I turned and started hiking as fast as I could, not caring if I lost the trail. I just needed to get back to the ridge. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Fast. Behind me, I ran. My pack slammed against my back as I tore through the brush. Branches whipped my face. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out. Then suddenly, I broke through the trees and onto the main trail. I didn't stop. I kept moving, kept pushing forward. The feeling of being watched never left. I made it back to my truck just as the sun was setting. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sped down the road. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who else was in those woods. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. I started my hike early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The trail was one I had done before, deep in the mountains, far from any towns or major roads. It wasn't an easy one, but that was part of why I liked it. It was quiet, remote, and challenging. I had planned a 2-day hike, packing light but carrying enough to get by. My backpack held the basics: water, some food, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight with extra batteries. My boots were broken in and sturdy, my jacket warm enough for the cold nights. I felt prepared. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled through the trees. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding up the mountain in switchbacks. I kept a steady pace, only stopping for quick water breaks. The higher I climbed, the more the landscape changed. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcrops and patches of dry grass. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I decided to rest and eat. I sat on a flat rock, pulled out a protein bar, and drank some water. The view stretched out for miles. I could see the valley below, the winding river cutting through it like a silver thread. The beauty of it was almost enough to make me forget how alone I was up here. Almost. I had always liked solo hiking, but something about today felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia and continued. The further I went, the less familiar the trail became. I had been here before, but something felt different. Trees that should have been there weren't. Rock formations I swore I had passed last time were missing. I checked my map and GPS. According to them, I was still on track. But my gut told me otherwise. I kept walking. The path grew steeper, the incline forcing me to slow down. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I was sweating despite the cold air. My legs burned. My breath came in short bursts, but I pushed forward. Then I saw it. A boot print, not mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth. Someone else was out here, but there was no sign of another hiker. No distant voices, no sound of footsteps, just that single print. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding harder than the climb had made it. Nothing moved. I waited, listening. The only sound was the wind. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was fine. Probably an old print from another hiker earlier in the morning. Still, I picked up my pace. As the day stretched on, the sense of unease grew stronger. The trail narrowed to a ledge, a steep drop on one side. I moved carefully, keeping my eyes down. That was when I heard it. A crunch, like a footstep on gravel. I stopped dead. The wind blew, rustling the bushes below. I turned slowly, scanning the area behind me. Nothing, just trees, rocks, and the long path I had just walked. I kept going, faster now. The trail curved, leading into a dense patch of forest. The trees were packed tight, their branches casting long shadows. It felt darker here, even though the sun was still up. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Then I found the second boot print. This time it was right in the middle of the trail, and next to it a second print. Side by side, like someone had stood there for a long time. I swallowed hard. My brain searched for explanations. Maybe it was just another hiker. Maybe they had taken a break here. Maybe I was overthinking, but something about it felt wrong. I kept moving, forcing my legs to keep up a steady pace. My hand hovered over the small knife in my pocket. Not enough to make me feel safe, but better than nothing. The forest stretched on. I had planned to make camp at a small clearing near a stream, but when I reached it, I hesitated. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now. Every rustling leaf made me tense. I decided to keep going. If I could make it a few more miles, I could set up camp closer to the next junction, where the trail forked toward another route. The sun was dipping low. Shadows stretched long across the ground. I walked faster. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not an animal. Too steady. Too deliberate. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees and silence. A bead of sweat dripped down my back. I kept moving. Then, just as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I saw something ahead on the trail. A backpack, just sitting there. No sign of its owner. No footprints leading away. Just a pack, right in the middle of the path. I stopped several feet away, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. It looked old, weathered. The fabric was torn in places, the straps frayed. I took a slow step closer. The zipper was halfway open. Inside, I could see something dark. A jacket? A sleeping bag? I didn't dare touch it. I turned, ready to get out of there. That's when I heard it. Not behind me, not ahead, right next to me. A breath. Slow, deep. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my flashlight, but I must have, because I was sprinting down the trail with the beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. My chest burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't anymore. My vision blurred, my body shaking. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Silence. Nothing chased me. Nothing moved. But I wasn't staying. I pulled out my map, found the shortest route back to the main road, and started walking. I didn't care how long it took. I didn't stop until I reached my car, just as the first light of morning touched the sky. I never went back to that trail. I never found out whose backpack that was. And I never forgot the sound of that breath, inches from my ear.